We all like to think that our favorite wrestlers will get a happy ending, and thankfully, in many cases, this has been exactly what's happened. Over the years, the likes of Steve Austin, Shawn Michaels, and Sting, just to name a few, have been able to walk off into retirement with things still going well. Unfortunately, though, not every performer gets this. No, some have to go through a sad decline before all is said and done, whether that decline be in real life or in the ring. But just who are the biggest examples of this in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Jake the Snake Roberts. Yes, we all know that over the course of his career, Jake Roberts had to deal with a lot of personal demons. Demons which were sparked by his pretty traumatic childhood. This meant that even when he was on top of the world, when he was a big star back during the golden era of the 80s WWF, he was struggling with addiction. Back then, however, it wasn't as obvious that he had such issues, because whenever it was time to go through the curtain and perform, the Gainesville native could channel all his pain into one of the most compelling wrestling characters of all time. Someone who, whether he was wrestling a match or cutting a promo, forced audiences to lean in closer and pay real attention to what he was doing, a vast difference from his peers at the time. But as the 90s came around and his personal issues started to get more and more out of control, even this great on-screen character wasn't enough to stop his life from going off the rails. No, this was the point that Jake lost himself in a spiral of addiction, with his downfall being immortalized in the documentary Beyond the Mat. Thank God things would turn around for him then, as at some point during the early 2010s, Jake would get help from his close friend, Diamond Dallas Page. With DDP's help, the Snake would manage to get back on the wagon again, a place he's remained for the most part ever since. That's right, rather than ending his story in tragedy, Jake Roberts has been able to turn things around, even finding regular employment in the wrestling industry again as the current manager of LA Faction and Goe in All Elite Wrestling. It's just a shame the same thing couldn't happen with our next subject, another person who got a lot of help from DDP, Scott Hall. Now, to say Scott Hall was one of the most underrated wrestlers of his era would be the understatement of the century. Back during the mid-90s, he was always a highlight of the WWF roster when he was playing the character of Razor Ramon. Sure, he may never have won a world title or anything, but his star power always shone bright, and that was why when he jumped over to WCW in 1996, it was a big enough deal that sparked what would soon become a game-changing angle for the entire industry, the NWO. Sadly, though, by the time the NWO was in full swing, Scott would already be crumbling in his personal life, as his addiction issues did a number on him. If you need any evidence of this being the case, you only have to look at some of his later appearances on WCW television, perhaps most infamously, his Last Call Scott Hall gimmick. Hell, even when he got a second chance with WWE in 2002, the bad guy still couldn't overcome his issues, and this led to his time in the WWE being shorter than it should have been. But, as we alluded to a moment ago, this wasn't the end for him. No, for a good few years before he passed away, he would be able to get his life back on track, mostly through the help of his friend Diamond Dallas Page. Sure, there would be the occasional bump in the road here and there, but for the most part, Scott was able to keep himself clean throughout the 2010s. Tragically, though, he would pass away in 2022. Yes, it was a sad way for his story to end, but at least there was some solace to be taken in the fact that after he had passed on, both fans and people working within the industry were quick to rain down love and tributes on him. Yes, Scott Hall will always go down as a legend of wrestling and arguably the greatest to never win a world title. Not that being a former world champion means you won't have a sad decline at the end of your life, though. No, sometimes this is just inevitable. And that was certainly the case for our next subject, Andre the Giant. Of course, in the case of Andre the Giant, it wasn't substance issues which led to his downfall. No, in his case, it was just pure genetics. With him suffering from gigantism for his entire life, there was never going to be a happy ending here. Not unless he got the surgery that ended up greatly extending the life of people like The Big Show. However, Andre's gargantuan size certainly made him a bigger star than he would have been otherwise. After all, how many people back then could walk into any territory they wanted to at any given time and become an instant main eventer? And how many people could become such a household name during the early 80s based on their look alone that they rivaled the likes of Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage? That said, this dedication to being as big of a star as possible also had a downside to it. Because as his life went on and he hit his 30s, the sheer stress his size was putting on his body meant he started to break down long before his time. That meant that during those final few years, when he was an active wrestler, anything post-Hulk Hogan feud, he'd be a shell of the wrestler he once was. Yes, in the space of a few years, Andre went from headlining WrestleMania 3 against the Hulkster to barely being mobile in undercard tag matches. When even this became too much for him, he'd have to step away from the ring entirely. Sadly, due to the strain his size was putting on his body, it would be in January of 1993 that Andre passed away, with him only being 46 years old at this point. Still, in many ways a young man. And because he passed on so young, it means we never got a chance to see what he might have done next in life, which is truly a tragic fact to have to accept. But for as sad as that was, there's an arguably even sadder tale to be found in the decline of our next subjects. And we say subjects because this one encompasses an entire family, the Von Erich family. Yes, if you've seen The Iron Claw, then you'll know all about the Von Erichs' tragic history. A truly Shakespearean tale if there ever was one. 6 brothers, one of whom passed away as an infant, and 4 of whom passed away in their 20s or early 30s. That's right, despite Kevin, Kerry, David, Mike, and Chris Von Erich all becoming wrestlers during the mid-80s for their father's territory, and with the power of their magnetic charisma and in-ring skills making WCCW one of the hottest places in the industry for a while, the whole thing would turn into a horror story. In 1984, at the age of just 25, David passed away while on a tour of Japan. Just 3 years later, in 1987, Mike Von Erich would also pass on, and this would come at just 23 years old. Then again, in 1991, Chris Von Erich, the youngest brother, also met the same fate. After this, Kerry Von Erich, someone better known to many fans as former Intercontinental Champion, the Texas Tornado, would also tragically pass away in February of 1993, while he was still just 33 years old. So that left only one brother remaining, Kevin Von Erich, who had to live the rest of his life without any of his siblings. Sure, in the years since, Kevin has been able to find some solace and become an inspirational tale of someone taking tragedy and turning it into something good. And the reason we say that is because, as things stand today, he lives in a family compound in Texas, surrounded by his wife, his children, and his grandchildren. Hell, 2 of his children, Marshall and Ross Von Erich, have even gone on to become wrestlers themselves. But even if this is the case, it's still hard to think of the Von Erich name and not see it as a sad story because they had so many terrible things happen to them over the years. But what about our next subject, that being the Dynamite Kid? Yes, this is a man who is one of the most influential wrestlers to ever lace up a pair of boots. Someone who pretty much started the modern high-flying style as we know it. But he certainly paid the price for all his athletic efforts over the years, and the price he paid was his body giving out on him. By the time he was in his 30s, this forced him into a wheelchair. No surprise, this was the end result. Of course, it wasn't just the physical aspect that led to Tom Billington's downfall. No, there was also the psychological aspect too. Because he was not an easy man to get along with. Hell, he could be an outright violent man to both friends and enemies, and this eventually led to a lot of people cutting him out of their lives completely by the time all was said and done. So because of that, we had a situation where, in one decade, the Dynamite Kid is riding high at the absolute cutting edge of the wrestling world, and in the next, he's living alone in his house in the UK. Truly, this represents a hell of a decline, one he probably never foresaw back when he was dominating the WWF Tag Team division with Davey Boy Smith, or going out to Japan to change the game for what wrestling could be. But sadly, that's how things ended up going for Tommy Billington. And when he passed away on his 60th birthday in December of 2018, fans were quick to recognize his legacy and what he did for the wrestling industry as a whole. And as it happened, Tom Billington isn't the only trailblazer of the wrestling industry who ended up having a dramatic downfall and passing on before their time. As the same thing happened with our next subject, Chyna. Chyna, a true game changer for women's wrestling, if there ever was one. And the reason Joanie Laurer became so highly regarded was because, back during the late 90s, she was an absolute phenomenon. Someone who quickly outgrew the limitations of being a women's wrestler and went on to become one of the most recognizable acts of the Attitude Era. Hell, so much did she break through during this time, she became the first, and to date, only woman to ever win the Intercontinental title. Sadly though, by the time 2001 came around and a new millennium was dawning, things would begin to falter for the ninth wonder of the world. How did this happen? Well, after leaving WWF in 2001, due to several issues behind the scenes, she was out of a job, and things started to spiral for Chyna as she fell into a pit of addiction. Not that this would overwhelm her completely right away, though. No, she'd continue to work for a little while, popping up in places like New Japan. But once that was over and the wrestling opportunities dried up, she'd find herself having to look toward other avenues which included starring in adult films. Yes, after a tape of her leaked online, Chyna decided to get into the adult industry. And that's what led to films like One Night in China being produced. And this would all end in tragedy, as in April of 2016, at just 46 years old, she passed away at too young an age. Honestly, if we were to rank these stories in terms of how sad they are, then this one would be pretty high up on the list. As it didn't have to be this way for someone who was such an icon to so many back at the turn of the millennium. But sometimes, having that level of adoration isn't enough to stop someone from losing themselves. And it appears this is exactly what happened with Chyna. But what of another notable women's star of that era? Someone who was less known for her time in the ring and more for her charisma on the mic. Well, she's our next subject as it happens. Because when it comes to Sunny, her decline was also a dramatic one. Yes, cast your mind back to 1995. That was the point Tammy Lynn Sitch first joined WWF and was given the new name of Sunny. And the reason she was given this name was because, aside from her sunny disposition, she was going to serve as the manager for her real-life boyfriend, Skip, better known to most as Chris Candido. But managing Skip wouldn't be the only thing Sunny did while in WWF. No, her talents quickly became apparent, and so it wasn't long before she was doing other things too, like handling backstage segments, in-ring interviews, and even spells on the commentary booth. Obviously then, this exposure, combined with her good looks, made her a star, particularly amongst the young male fanbase of the time. Such a star would she become. In fact, at one point, she was the most downloaded woman on AOL back during the early days of the internet. So where did the problems begin for her then? Well, like with so many others we've looked at today, Tammy fell into addiction, and this would cause her numerous problems in her personal life as the years went on, as well as make her several enemies backstage. Of course, that's not the only reason she made enemies backstage, though. No, there were also constant rumors of attitude problems on her part. And when she started having a rumored affair with Shawn Michaels during the latter half of the decade, this caused even more people to turn on her, particularly those who were loyal to Chris Candido. So it was then, when she was finally cut from her WWF contract in 1998, that there weren't many clamoring for her to come back. And this lack of an option to return to the company led her and Chris further down the pit of addiction. Where would this end for them? Well, in 2005, Chris Candido would pass away. And now, without her support network, Sunny would spiral further. As for the next 2 decades, every time you heard her name in the news, it was followed by a disastrous story. And all this reached its peak when in 2022, she was sentenced to 17 and a half years in prison. But not all sad stories have a sad ending. No, some can end on a more positive note, as is the case with our next subject, Jeff Hardy. Yes, Jeff Hardy, the man who, if things had worked out just a little differently, would be on top of the wrestling world today as one of its greatest legends. After all, this is a man who completely captured the hearts of alternative kids everywhere during the late 90s and early 2000s, and who influenced an entire generation to lace up their boots for the first time. Seriously, so popular was this guy at one point, his merchandise was outselling John Cena. And that led to WWE finally deciding to pull the trigger on him as world champion in a singles capacity in 2008, after years of him being a tag team specialist. Unfortunately, though, not long after that trigger was pulled, it became apparent WWE had made a mistake, as they remembered why it had taken them so long to make such a move in the first place. The reason for this being that Jeff had his own personal issues with addiction. Understandably, then, the two sides would part ways not long after this, and that would lead to Jeff finding work over in TNA instead. And while TNA had no such qualms about pushing their newest signing to the moon at first, they soon learned the hard way too that asking him to stay clean at this time was a tall order. Just go back and watch the infamous match with Sting at Victory Road 2011, where he came down to the ring in no condition to perform, leading to the company having to call a quick audible and get things wrapped up urgently before someone could get hurt. And that's the way things would continue for Jeff in the years following too, with him getting multiple chances in just about every company under the sun, continually struggling to battle with his personal demons. And that's made all the more tragic when you consider just how big he's been when he's been at his peak. Seriously, this is someone who, if things were just a little different, would probably be thought about in the same breath as Shawn Michaels or John Cena. Fortunately, though, it seems like Jeff has finally managed to clean his life up and is on the straight and narrow. And we hope this all leads to him and his brother one day returning to WWE for one final run and a Hall of Fame induction. Because even if things haven't always worked out for him the way they were planned, he's still, without a doubt, one of the greatest talents we've ever seen. But what about the sad downfall of our next subject, that being Magnum TA? That's right, we're going back to the territory days, as it's there in the mid-80s that we find Magnum TA. The man who, at one point, looked all set to be the next big breakout babyface of Jim Crockett Promotions. And this was someone JCP desperately needed, as with WWF starting their own golden era on the other channel, and them booming in popularity as a result, the gap between the two sides was starting to widen significantly. Of course, with Magnum TA being the perfect guy to appeal to the audience, the hope was that this gap would be closed again before long. And that's exactly what led to the Virginian quickly rising up the ranks over the next couple of years, as he won the NWA United States Heavyweight Championship on 2 separate occasions. And it wasn't just holding the gold which was raising his stock back then. No, it was also the matches he was having while doing so. After all, who can forget about that steel cage match Magnum had against Tully Blanchard at Starrcade 1985? To this day, probably still the greatest cage match we've ever seen. Really, after a certain point, it was just a matter of waiting for him to finally challenge Ric Flair for the NWA World's title and win it, with this fully solidifying him as the guy to lead the charge against Vince McMahon and Hulk Hogan. Tragically, though, before that could happen, Magnum TA's career would be cut short when he was involved in a car accident on October 14, 1986, which left him with a broken back. Yes, right before he could reach the mountaintop, the rug would be pulled out from under the Virginian. And in the process, the rug would be pulled out from JCP too, as it wouldn't be until the rise of Sting a few years later that they finally found that next top babyface. Would Magnum ever wrestle again following this? Unfortunately, no. His back would be too damaged for that. And so, just as quickly as it started, the saga of Magnum TA came to an end. And we were all left to wonder what might have been had that accident not occurred. Would Jim Crockett have risen to the level of being able to seriously challenge 80s WWF? Maybe, who knows? They might have even beaten them. And that would have left a very different landscape for people like our next subject during the 90s. Someone who also had a dramatic downfall. someone who goes by the name of Perry Saturn. Now, when it comes to Perry Saturn, he was unlikely to make it all the way to the world title. No, he was more of a guy you might refer to as a solid hand or even a wrestler's wrestler. And that's not to diminish him, of course. No, people like that are very important in the world of wrestling. And over the course of his career, Perry certainly filled this role well. It doesn't matter if he was working in ECW, WCW, WWF, or anywhere else. He always delivered on what he was asked to do, and this made him a valuable addition to any promoter's roster of talent. Where does this downfall come into play with him then? Well, that happened in the mid-2000s, when after the wrestling work began to dry up, Perry found himself going through a difficult spell. And it was during this spell that, like many wrestlers before him, he would sadly fall into addiction. And things would get out of control for Perry because he'd end up homeless. And it's at this point he disappeared off the radar completely for several years, with even some of his closest friends being unsure as to where he was. Thankfully, however, in 2010, he would show up once more. At this point, revealing that he had gotten himself cleaned up and was ready to start rebuilding his life. We can only hope that we hear more positive endings for other wrestlers who have had a tough time of it. Because, as we've seen today, wrestling can be a tough business to be in.